And we're back. So this is going to be a post-mortem for my Ludum Dare 42 entry, Drone Gardening League. It's available now. If you have not rated it for judging for Ludum Dare, stop watching this and please play the game and rate it before you watch what I think about it. I don't want to skew your perspective or anything like that. This is the game. It is a game where you fly drones around and garden in a competitive way. It's a weird game. This is kind of the setup for the game. In between rounds, you build up a deck of these cards. You have to have 15 cards, and then you go into the garden arena. I don't know, it's not actually named in-game. Well, while I'm here, you can pick your drone up here in the top right. Helicopter's pretty cool. And I'm gonna click garden. So here we're in the game, and I am the helicopter on the right side doing circles. I have direct control. I can just move around this island, and you can see the cards are coming in from my deck, and they're at the bottom of the screen, and it is up to me to take one of them. So I've selected this mushroom, and I can plant it. It'll take some time to grow, and I'll get a new card in the meantime, and I can keep planting. And now you can see that all the cards are grayed out, and I need resources for them. So there's 3 types of resources that you have to manage. There's water, which all of these need. There's power, and then there's, I never really came up with a name for it. I think I might have used goop or crystals or elixir. I don't remember what I used. But it's the purple hexagons. I couldn't come up with a good name. I don't remember what it was. So if I hover over my recharge station here, I'll recharge the power. If I hover over the water, I'll pick up water. And once I have enough to do something with it, I can use those resources to cast this card and plant a plant. I can only plant things in the grassy area, which is automatically expanding as I plant things. I'll plant another thing. Every one of the plants is different slightly and has kind of unique behavior, unique feature. So like this sunflower here will recharge my energy slowly. The like spore looking thing, the purple and pink thing it'll attack enemies that come close. See, these things are kind of attacking me. It's a little hard to see, but they'll attack things. The number 4 plant here will attack other plants. This is maybe a bad example. I should have put that somewhere better. This pumpkin here will explode. This cactus has high HP. I want to see that cactus explode now. Oh, not quite. And then there's a couple special ability cards that I can use that do different things. But that's the basic game loop. As I plant things, I am being scored, and you can see my score in the top left. I'm losing pretty badly here. Let me poison them, do some damage, drop a poison cloud on them. But I'm getting scored for my garden, and ultimately the point is not to eliminate the opponent, who's kind of doing his own gardening. It is to have the best garden, which may involve some amount of conflict. This is actually probably the oddest map where the players aren't connected. And also some of the other maps there's a 4-player map and a 3-player map. But the point is to get this score, which it's a very simple scoring system. And then it's a timed round, so after 5 minutes it ends. The first round is a bit shorter, and the AI in the first round is a bit dumber. So that first one is just to get your bearings and get used to the controls. So that's the game. Let's talk about how I got there and then things that happened and stuff. Theme selection was a bit odd this time around. I'm super busy for reasons outside of game dev and just had very little time to prep for this Ludum Dare. So I really didn't. Usually when I'm prepping for like Ludum Dare or something, I'll kind of look at all the final themes and kind of come up with some good ideas. And this time I really didn't do that. I had one idea for this theme, a couple other themes, a couple other ideas, but not a lot. So I was a little bit confident because I've done this now. This is my 13th Ludum Dare, so I had some confidence that I could figure it out, whatever I wanted to do. But you know, I had to make do on the day. And when the theme was announced, I saw it in the car and was like, okay, what can I do? What can I do? What can I do? The one idea that I had come up with, I kind of immediately I threw out pretty quickly. As like, it's not a great fit. But what I kind of thought about was a game idea that I had for a while. I was kind of mentally going through different ideas that I've had over time and kind of trying to get some inspiration. And one of these ideas that I had was for a game a little bit like maybe Advanced Wars, but with a deck of cards that is like an action selection mechanism. So you can, you know, build your deck of cards before going into battle, and maybe this time I'm going to take the fighter jets because I think they're going to be useful. Maybe next time I don't take those, I take something that lets my troops move further or attack more powerfully or something like that. I've wanted to play with that for a while, and this game is obviously nothing like that, but that was where the like kind of little spark of inspiration came from, was that. Because I thought about that and I thought, well, what if, how would that translate to the theme of, you know, running out of space? Well, what if it wasn't just like you're moving troops around a map, but you're just like plopping down troops and filling the whole map, like, you know, paradropping in or something. The military sort of theme no longer really made sense, unless it was like maybe trench warfare or something. It seemed like a bad idea. Maybe slimes, that was the first idea. Like, okay, you're just slimes expanding out across this map to fill it. But at some point I kind of thought about, you know, what about plants? What about like gardening or something? That's Plants vs. Zombies was definitely something that came up in my mind of like, you know, that they chose plants because it really conveyed that these things are kind of stationary, and trying to like move things around was going to be clunky. So if it's just you're planting new things, you're sort of filling the map. And pretty quickly I thought of the name of the game. I didn't actually use it, but this was a great dumb idea, which was competitive space gardening. It's really dumb, but that was what kind of sold the whole idea for me. It was like, okay, I got it. Competitive space gardening. So the big idea with my original game was like you would maybe have this mech that you're moving around and you have to weigh, like, do I move that and make it do an awesome move? Or do I like move some troops or fire some artillery or something like that? And that made less and less sense with the game I was kind of coming towards. And like, it feels weird if you can't always move your mech each turn, where it might be a bit different if it was like you're commanding an army and that's an option you have, but now you're just a drone flying around a garden. Like, why do you have to choose between moving around or placing plants? That's weird. Is it just a clunky cursor? Because like that's the center of things. You have to move your drone to something to do an action. Otherwise, it'd be weird. Somewhere thinking through all these things, it was like, well, maybe real time makes more sense. It kind of simplifies some things and solves some of those problems, and kind of makes more sense with kind of where I was headed in this gardening sort of a game. So with the idea of real time, that kind of made me think of air mech, because you're piloting drones around and, you know, you're kind of commanding things below you. And I wanted to avoid that, and combat's a whole big system. If I could avoid combat, that would be, you know, one less thing I have to do. Plus, you know, it's gardening. It doesn't make as much sense if you're, you know, directly like shooting missiles at another drone. If I can avoid it, you know, hey, let's do that. So I should probably, you know, try to minimize that part of it and just focus on the like your building, which is something air mech doesn't quite do. At least, I don't know. So it's been like 6 or 7 different games since I last played it. That did raise a number of problems. The big one being the victory condition of like, Okay, I'm flying this drone around and dropping down flowers. Like, what's the victory condition? Originally, I was thinking, you know, kill the other drone or destroy their base or something. That doesn't really work anymore, and I was worried that I was making another game that was too long. I've done this a number of times for Ludum Dares. I've made games that are too long. So I wanted to, like, if you're constantly dropping flowers and kind of filling the space and then kind of pushing against the enemy, that could take a while to deal with. So eventually I settled on the idea of like the scoring thing. And if I had a little more time, I'd probably focus a little bit more on that. I was thinking maybe that would be like a game show. You know, that could kind of tie in that name idea that I'd had originally. But anyway, that's where kind of the design was coming from and how I landed on where I did. Eventually, competitive space gardening didn't really fit what I'd made. So pretty late into the development, I was like, well, I should come up with a better name that's more reflective of the actual game as it's turning out. And Drone Gardening League was eventually what I came up with. It's still stupid. It's great. Let's talk about the art direction. So I was coming from that like Advanced Wars mindset, and so that was kind of my first thought was like, well, maybe something like Advanced Wars. And then I actually looked at Advanced Wars, and my memory of it is different than how that actually looks in game. So that was, it wasn't going to look as good, and that there was a lot more, simultaneously more and less detail, and it was a different scale of assets, and that style I don't think was going to work. So I had to figure something out. Particularly as I was moving towards a real-time concept, I started to think about some of the existing tech that I had around. I have this like fake 3D sort of a rendering system and camera system that I developed for this game back in Ludum Dare 33, which is kind of like a top-down RTS. And it kind of gives the illusion of 3D through just 2D assets. It's a real simple dumb trick, and I'll show a little bit more about that later. And I used it in another Ludum Dare entry a while later, and eventually that turned into a real game that you can download on the Windows Store. Download Binary Heresy today for free. So anyway, that was as it was moving to real time, that seemed like a good idea, but I was a little bit worried because both of these use higher resolution, like kind of more polygonal looking styles. Like this is just lines, and eventually got some like blur effects and things. But this was kind of a flat polygonal shape, and they're higher resolution assets. And I was a little worried about pixel art. I sort of knew I kind of needed to do pixel art in some fashion, because I needed a lot of different plants to feel kind of vibrant and alive and colorful. And I knew I needed a lot of different cards, and if it's real time, they have to be iconographic. There has to be something that you can look at and go, that's the thing that I want to use. So to generate that many assets, really, it kind of had to be pixel art, probably. I did debate this like kind of polygonal style, but I didn't need to do that, and it would have been more work for sure. Because I built this out and sampled it, and it worked better than I was expecting. And there were some problems getting it to render precisely because of the scaling that's going on and things. I did have a backup plan, which was to use some of the rendering tech that I've used a couple times before, which is like this kind of angled sort of pixel thing. Effectively, it's what I do is I draw pixel art with some extra data, and then use a shader that takes that and kind of uses the things I put in there to kind of intelligently add 45-degree angle pieces to give kind of a more interesting look. That was the backup plan. Luckily, I didn't need to do that, but I did start down that route, and you can see that in the cards where I started doing that with the cards, and then turns out I didn't really need to do that. Once I had the camera set, I realized you were never going to notice that detail, but I never actually circled back to the cards to fix them, so they just look like a mistake. So I did have one problem that I kind of didn't fully realize in advance, which is the shadow. Because you're a flying drone, you need to know where you are, since a lot of these cards you have to fairly precisely place them, and you have to be on top of your base or on top of water to get those resources. So especially when you're like in this corner here, your position as a drone is fairly visually different than the cell you're under. So I had to have a shadow. Technically, it is just a flat plane that is drawing a semi-transparency at the level of the ground, and you can see that as I go over water. Your shadow would not just stay in place like that. That doesn't really make sense with the rest of the like 3D geometry, and it's really bad, particularly over your base, where like, that's not really where you are, and you can end up in some scenarios where you're slightly off because I didn't center the camera around the player. A lot of these problems go away if you are towards the center, towards the focus point, because then it's fairly obvious what you're hovering over. But that was a bummer, and I didn't realize how complicated that was going to be. I think I could probably eventually fix it, but like I was thinking about what kind of shader work that would take, and it was like, oh boy, that's going to be a nightmare. Maybe I should have implemented a more obvious like targeting reticule instead of the shadow, because then that wouldn't have been quite as jarring. Like I think the shadow really falls apart as you move over like some of these 3D objects. I wanted to show you what this looks like with without the kind of 3D effect and kind of show you what it's doing. This is kind of without the 3D effect, and you'll notice that I've just like fixed the shadow, like it doesn't get offset as you move out towards the edges. This was sort of my fallback plan as like a way to still show 3D things. It looks pretty flat though, so I'm glad I didn't have to do this. Like like I said, I was really worried about this pixel style, but this worked out. And then here's what this looks like from a straight overhead, which is me just fiddling with camera settings. It's like, this looks like real, just boring looking. So it's really like that camera, like it really makes a big difference. And it works really well. Like I'm really happy with how it looks, and how good like the pixel style meshes with the that pseudo 3D camera. So I want to talk about the AI a little bit, because the AI is fairly simple, but I think that might be interesting to some folks, since the AI feels maybe smarter than it actually is. They don't cheat or anything, but it's fairly simple, fairly effective. I knew the game had to have an AI, like it really did. The game would not have worked very well if there was no AI enemy. I didn't want to resort to like a second player, like two players with the same keyboard. That wasn't really going to be an option. Actually, that would have been more complicated than an AI, I think. So anyway, let's jump into the code a little bit. This is what the AI is doing each frame. It's not a lot. There's kind of just a simple, like, if the drone is killed, then it sort of just resets. And then there's really just kind of two sort of states that it could be in, which is like, well, it's either just performing some action or it's panicking. The panicking almost never really comes up, as it turns out, but if they're not already panicking, each frame it just checks for some interrupts, which are basically like, did it take damage? And is it like, did it take damage and is it below a certain threshold? Or did something happen and it can no longer use the card it was going to use, which I don't think is actually a state it can ever get in. And so if there's no interrupts, then it's in this state where it's just doing some task. And when there is not a task, then it looks for a new one. But if there is a task, if it already knows what it needs to do, the AI doesn't just really do anything. It's waiting for that task to complete. So most of the work for the AI is in figuring out what is the next task. So this is that code down here. Looks like a lot. It's not that bad. It's fairly simple. It's if it needs energy, it goes back home and just sits there for a second or two. If it needs water, it does some real simple check to find what is the closest source of water and go there and sit. And that's the task, is go there, sit. So what this run sequentially is doing. It's finding safe water, and then it's idling for 1.5 seconds. So those are the first, like, those are the highest priority tasks of like, well, if it needs it, it should go do that. Luckily, I can, because I'm designing the whole thing, I can design the game such that none of the cards are, or very few of the cards are really so expensive that this is going to be a real problem where like they won't have enough resources. And like I don't have a system of like evaluating a card and going, oh, I don't have enough. So then there's a random chance of the drone just doing nothing. And this is here because the first time I did this, I didn't have it, and the drone just whooped me. Like the AI drone just whooped me. It's very efficient, and it'll very quickly go, oh, I need to do that, oh, I need to do that, oh, I need to do that, and it's way faster than you can ever be. So there's just a good chance, and if it's in the tutorial, it idles a lot more. And that's just the task, is idle for 1 second. So then if it doesn't do any of those things, like the higher priority things, then it falls back to, okay, let's play a card. And this is fairly simple. It goes through the cards that it has in its hand, picks one based on like a priority. So once it has a card, it says, okay, well, we're going to select that card, and then we'll determine what to do. The simpler case is down here, which is just like, is it something that I can cast right this second? Each card has a little bit of code in there to say, is it a good time to cast this thing? Like, am I short on health? Then cast the healing thing. And if it does, then it'll actually cast that card, it'll use that card. And if it's not, then it'll just discard it. So most of the cards use this grid template, grid target thing up here, which is more like the, I need to do this in a place. I can't just do this where I'm sitting. So I need like plant a flower or drop bone meal on them and to make them grow or heal something or poison something. So all the cards, most of the cards use this. And this is where it's a little bit more complicated, where each card has a little bit of code to say, what is a good target location on the map, which is generally fairly simple. Just evaluate the whole grid and say, this is the closest one to the base that has this requirement met or whatever. And if it can't find a place for whatever reason, there's no invalid or whatever, then, well, okay, discard it. But otherwise, it's go to that tile, sit over that tile for 1 second, and then actually like cast that card in the same way that the player does. So that's the AI. It's fairly simple. It's just like, checking for interrupts and getting a new task and actually doing it. And to actually look at what doing that task, we'll jump over to... So this is the drone itself, which is kind of what we're talking to say, hey, go here. And this is a very simple bit of code, which is it just has a target. So when we say go to this tile, it just says, okay, go to this tile. And then every frame, if it's not already there, go towards it. Done. And this task is just like saying, set that target. And then every frame, this little animation thing is just checking, has the drone reached its position? And when it's reached its position, then the task is complete. I have a lot of systems to build off of to like make this work, like this animation framework. But ultimately, it's fairly simple, I think, for me. I don't know. Sometimes it feels like people are a little bit scared of AI in Ludum Dare games and then don't really, do anything too complicated and maybe just do what they've done before. But if you're familiar with it and you've done it a few times, you can kind of get a sense of what it'll take, and it helps to be able to kind of design around the AI and design for the limitations. Like, since these are just drones, I don't have to deal with pathfinding, and I knew that, and that's convenient. But if you can find shortcuts like that, that's helpful. Otherwise, you might have to, plan for that and deal with it. Okay, let's get a little negative. I want to talk about the controls of this game. I think the controls are bad, and I knew that on Sunday. Like, just playtesting the game, it was like, this isn't working. With hindsight now, I can kind of see how I could solve the problem, and I did, and that's the post-compo version. But at the time, it was just like, this is bad, and I don't know what to do. But I couldn't come up with a solution at the time, and even if I could, I don't know that I would have had the time to really implement it. So this is the compo version. I'm going to select a card. It moves it to like this pending area so that I can see where I'm going to put it. And then the controls switch. I have to hit space to actually use it. So I put space and I drop. That's fairly straightforward and everything's labeled on screen, but the thing is that like when I selected a card, if I select number 1 here, well, now there's a new number 1. Everything just shifted over. So like you can't really plan things out that effectively. Like if I wanted to quickly do that, switch to a thing, drop that on the ground, that doesn't work. And actually, I just made a mistake there that highlights the problem where I missed. And if you miss, the logic is such that like it just puts it back in the hand of cards. And now I have to pick a different number to pull that back and drop it. And because this is like a multi-stage process, it's press that and then space, or I can press backspace to throw it out or delete to throw it out. But there's like 3 different buttons that are relevant in addition to moving around, and it's easy to get the wrong one or click the wrong button. So why is it this way? Well, first thing is the need to be able to like position something where you're kind of a little bit imprecise with your positioning, and so you need to know like I need to drop it here. So you can't just like have a 1 button to just drop it. That's not going to work. Fairly obviously. So I thought like, well, maybe it's just hold the key down and then release it to drop the thing. So you can see that like guide of, you know, here's the thing I want. It affects this area, or it is going to drop in this area, or whatever it does. And then like when you release it, it actually uses it. But you can pretty easily get into a state where you really need to discard a card. Like just the way your deck is built, you end up with just nothing you can do. So you have to be able to discard a card. So then that becomes really awkward of like, do you press a button to engage like a discard mode and then switch off? Yeah, that's not great. But really, I think the bigger one is the controls changing, the numbering changing, and whenever anything changes to your hand of cards, it pushes the card to the end. Okay, so here's the game running with the new control scheme. It's a lot simpler. I just hold the button and it'll discard it. If I hold it long enough, that black border means it'll do that. I press the button to select it, I press the button to drop it. Same button, nothing changes, and that same slot is reserved. Like, now that seems obvious. Like, it's just way simpler. It still may not be perfect, but it is massively improved over what I had before. Anyway, that's the new one. Now it's just arrow keys and 4 buttons, as opposed to like the controller support was movement plus the 4 face buttons plus the 2 triggers, right, for like drop and left for discard. And it was a mess. And I got there because you have to remember I was coming at this from a very different game that it ended up being, and like originally thinking, okay, this is going to be a turn-based, tile-based game where you'll have time to look at the cards. And your deck building was going to be a component of it one way or another. So the card system is something that I've used in a number of games. Recently, I used it in this Conquestia for one of the recent Ludum Dares. But like that card system is based around a hand of cards and turn-based movement and stuff. So that was the first thing I implemented, and that makes sense as a metaphor for a turn-based game, is you're just getting cards into your hand, and the like putting things back and shuffling the order doesn't really matter. But when it's real time, that just doesn't work. But it was a big change for me to do that post-compo thing, to say, now there's these 4 slots and stuff like that. Was a fairly big change from what was just a hand of cards. So like I said, I could not figure out a better thing at the time, and it's a real bummer the way it landed, but nobody's mentioned it in the comments so far. It may be the sort of thing that like I noticed because I played it a lot more. If you're just playing it once or twice, maybe you just think like, oh, it's maybe just slightly awkward, but it's not that strange, not that difficult. I just need to get used to it or something. I don't know. But you play it a little bit and you start to realize like, no, it's not great. So let's talk about what went well and what went poorly and kind of wrap up. What went well? I think the art style turned out great, and like I said, I was really worried about it coming together, like the pixel art and the scaling and some of the other aspects. And it's really good that it did come out, because I think I will likely use that again. Probably a lot. There's a lot of things that I want to explore because I've got some ideas for games in the distant future, probably at this point. But generating assets and art is a bottleneck for me. So something like that allows a lot of good content generation quickly that looks interesting and allows for a lot of flexibility. And I'd thought about this before, and I didn't think it was going to work out as well as it did. So there's still some big questions around, like, does this translate to a game that has maybe larger structures on the board? Because it's just a lot of 2D flat planes. How is that going to look with a bunch of planes kind of translating across each other? And how is it going to look with more complicated or organic characters or monsters or things like that? I think I will probably experiment with it more, probably in future Ludum Dares until I start working on a real project for it. But it seems like it has a lot of potential, which is good. Like I said, really came out the art style really came out better than I expected. What else went well? Somehow I managed to get like a collectible card game deck building thing in there, which I did not think that was going to happen. Like on Sunday, I designed the game very much like there's going to need to be some amount of like picking cards or something, because I can't just throw you into it with all these cards that do strange things. There's got to be a little bit of a period, and there's no time to read stuff while you're playing. So, I mean, the original design was like a deck building sort of thing. You are in a phase where you build your deck and then you play. But on Sunday, I had no code for that like deck building thing, and luckily that came together really fast. It looks ugly, horribly ugly, but it's functional. And that was the big thing, was getting that functional. So now every game from now on out is going to have deck building elements, because that worked well. Yeah, it was a bunch of UI work, and I did not have anything like that, but I had various UI controls that I could leverage that I was familiar enough with that it came together and worked out. It was buggy. It was one of the biggest sources of bugs in the game. Other things, the gameplay is fairly fun. I'm pretty happy with that. I didn't know how it was going to turn out, because to me it felt very experimental and very weird, of like this real time, also having this hand of cards that you have to manage, and 3 different types of resources, which is maybe a bit much. We'll get there. But it works out, and it's fairly fun, and it's different, and I like that it's not just a combat game. I like that there's some amount of that to it, but it's not direct combat. Which I like any opportunity to do something different like that. I'm pretty happy with the variety of cards and the variety of plants, and it felt like there's enough things in there to actually kind of get some good playtime out of, with maybe just a little bit of tweaks here and there. I don't know. There's a fair bit of depth to just what I was able to do in a weekend, which is pretty cool. Other things, the AI is fairly smart, and like I said, at one point they kind of whooped me the first time because I didn't throttle them down. So that was neat that worked out, because that was another thing that was like, I knew it had to be in there. The game's designed around an AI opponent, and on Sunday I did not have an AI opponent, so it wasn't my first rodeo, so I knew I could do it, but it worked out fairly well, and I think it feels pretty effective. So let's talk about what went poorly. The card rendering was really not great. It was taken from, some parts of it were taken from code that I had for other things, and then kind of I shoehorned stuff into it. But one of the big ones is just that I got the scaling wrong on a few things. Like the actual cards are scaled here when they don't really need to be. Like I should try to constrain them so that they are an even multiple. So the font just looks bad at the bottom of the screen, because I was like kind of first and foremost making sure that it was like the hand was positioned on screen well before like the cards were scaled well, just because the scaling is also, it's doing this like pixel sampling that just does not work well here, but I'm using that in other elements that are being drawn. But there's some other issues with the card rendering, which is like the well, the numbering here just covers up the cost, which doesn't make a huge difference. You never have time to read it, and that's why the big icons are kind of floating on top of them when you need stuff. But just the actual icons that are being drawn don't scale well on the rendered card, even at full resolution. And I think I mentioned before the like that angled pixel shader thing. It didn't work out. It looks like a mistake because I didn't go back and clean up the ones that I had already implemented this on. Other things went poorly. I talked about controls already. That was really, I think, one of the biggest letdowns of the jam, the compo. I wish that had been better, and I figured that out sooner. The resources are maybe a bit much. It's at the border of being too complicated, like having to manage your water and your power and the gems or whatever, which don't even have a name, so they're not that great. I think you get a feel for it, and that's why there's that tutorial period. I think you can get a feel for it. The other problem with the resources is that you have to be fairly precise around your positioning over the tower and over water, and that kind of ties into some of the controls and some of the way the player is rendered and that like shadow issue I discussed earlier. But I don't know how obvious it is what you need to do, and there's enough going on in with a real-time game that it is hard to really plan to efficiently go, I'm going to get energy, and I know I need this much energy and this much water to do this thing, and it's efficient to go through this route. Like you kind of have to move faster than that. So another thing that could have gone better is the audio. The audio is functional, but barely. It was really slapped in half an hour, and that would have been something that would have gone just to the cutting room and just been like, oh, forget audio this time, because I've definitely done that before. It's usually not my highest priority as a developer. I'm not that great at it, and I can make do. But I kind of needed audio, really. Like I just mentioned it being a little difficult to tell when you're hovering over something, like the power of like, am I actually over the right thing? That audio feedback I think was really important, and that was 100% why I was like, no, I need audio. I'm going to spend half an hour and just hammer out some really kind of lousy SFXR effects and just plug them in. So it felt like I really had to do it, and it's in there, but it's barely functional. At least it plays for the enemy stuff doing things too, so there's a little bit more sound than just the like silence all the time. But you know, some ambient audio would have been good. Music would have been good. Music would have taken more time than I had. I was too short on time by that point. And the last thing that I'll mention is that the scoring isn't really obvious. I described the scoring in the Ludum Dare post, and it's still not that obvious to me, but I hadn't considered it as much of a problem, but it was one of the first things that came up in the comments, which kind of surprised me. But it makes a lot of sense when you say it, like, oh yeah, I guess it isn't clear, and it hasn't been clear when I'm playing, like, what am I doing well or not? I don't get enough feedback, and I think that's an easy enough to solve problem. I just hadn't realized it at the time. I think probably I would, every time there's like one of those, every time there's one of those scoring rounds, I think it would like maybe do an animation that kind of pans across the whole map and is like +1, +1, +1 to kind of indicate like, oh, it's scoring the current garden. Or I change the scoring mechanism to be something else, like as opposed to evaluating everything and scoring based on that, kind of score based on like certain actions. I don't know, that sounds tricky. That sounds tricky to actually really balance, and kind of the kind of constant scoring system I think makes a little bit more sense, but wasn't that obvious. So to wrap things up, I want to talk about the future of Drone Gardening League. I don't think I will ever really turn this into like a complete game. It's probably just going to be the prototype for Ludum Dare, and that'll probably be the end of it. It's neat. Don't get me wrong, it's neat and it's kind of fun, but I've got so many more things on my plate to work on, and some of the tech out of here is really cool, and I'm sure some of that code will show up in things in the future. I've learned a lot, I would say, with the way the pixel art renders and some of the things that work and some of the things that don't work in terms of like that rendering style. And I'm definitely going to be exploring that in future and kind of playing with things and trying to do other styles and stuff like that. And the deck building thing, every game is going to be a deck building game now. No, but seriously, that worked pretty well, and I'm pretty happy with it. And it's something that doesn't show up in Ludum Dare games very often. And it's complicated to get that all set up and to have a game that works with it and would take advantage of it. But it's a mechanic I like, so I was happy with how that worked out. So it was another fun weekend overall, and I'm pretty happy with the game. I haven't. This is the week after the compo ended, so don't have final results. Hopefully I did all right, but it was fun. So until next time.